Hey YouTube, how do I know what frames per second to use to shoot my video with? And I see a lot of people on YouTube saying, use this, got to use 24 frames a second. No excuse. Video will look bad if you don't. You've got to use 30 frames a second. You got to use 60 frames a second. You got to use 120 frames a second. Really? No. You see, frames per second are creative choices. And so I'm going to walk you through when you should use certain frames per second according to what you're shooting, not as use this as the only rule of thumb of frames per second, because there are times that some work better than others. Now on your camera, you'll have frames per second in your menu under your movie settings. It's usually somewhere under there, depends on what you're shooting with. And camera manufacturers give you, usually a 30, a 60, a 120. It can either be in 4K or 1080. And some cameras, maybe like the GH5, have more selections for frames per second that you can shoot at. And then the other thing that goes with frames per second, it's an equation, is your shutter speed, which is the dial on your camera that you can dial in just like you do for photography. It's the shutter speed. And what you want to try to do always is double the shutter speed per frames per second. So if you have 30 frames per second set on your camera, you want your shutter speed to be at 1/60th or as close to that as you can get. And that goes for each up and down frames per second that you are using. Now, does that matter? It matters to a large degree. The 24 frames a second is what we call motion canvas. It gives the blur in the image, a natural movement to the eye. There's no trick in that it suddenly makes your video cinematic. I'll get into that in another video because there's a lot more things that make a video cinematic than just frames per second. Okay, that's only a small part of the equation. But for general, when you're shooting people, talking heads, interviews, the movement is fairly steady. It's 24 frames a second. That's generally what Hollywood is going to be shooting at because of the motion canvas, because of the flow and the blur with it. It looks natural. 30 frames a second is usually used on television, and that's a little more crisp. But if you are shooting on a gimbal, if you're shooting run and gun with your camera, 30 frames a second is a better choice because you can smooth it out a little bit better, and it's a little crisper and you don't get too much blur. So that's a good time to use 30 frames a second. I use 30 frames a second on my gimbal. You can use 24 frames a second on your gimbal. It's absolutely fine. Okay? It's not a do or die. For my stock video purposes, I generally shoot at 30 frames a second. I will go down to 24 frames a second, especially in low light, because the lower frames per second is going to let in just a little bit more light, and so that's beneficial to me when I'm shooting in the dark. Why do I pick 30? It's because if you take 30 frames a second and you drop it in a timeline of 24, it's just a tiny bit slowed down, which fits in nicely. But if you take a 24 frames a second and drop it in a 30, you have to add frames. You have to interpolate frames to it. So as far as it goes, I like to shoot at 30 when possible for my stock. You can shoot stock at 24. It's not going to hurt you because the modern browsers today and editors, the modern video editors, people just drop in the clips of what they need and it just conforms fine. And so those few frames a second in between, that is not going to affect a movie or anything else. I have shot at 30 frames a second for a Hollywood producer and he used it in a 24p timeline. It's fine, okay? Now, the 120 frames a second has a few amazing things that can be done, not just in the slow motion side, because you want to shoot 120 frames a second, obviously, for slow motion or higher. I have cameras that shoot 240 frames a second in a full in 1080 and up from that. So the quality doesn't look great on the cameras I have past 240, but I can shoot 240 frames a second. Now I use 1080 at 120 frames a second when I'm running and gunning and holding my camera. So let's just say I don't have a gimbal or stabilizer, but I'm walking with my camera. When you slow down 120 frames a second, it really smooths out the motion. So if you're focusing on walking correctly and carefully with your camera, and you don't have any other stabilizers, and you slow that down to a 30p or 24p timeline footage from 120, it ends up being really smooth. It looks like it was on a gimbal. So you add a little warp stabilization in post to your 120, and it works. And when I've been in a pinch, and you know, I actually prefer to shoot 30, but I would also like more camera movement in the shot, and I deem the camera movement is going to look better, I switch over to 120, and then so I can get a smooth shot of what I'm doing with my camera, which the stabilization side is actually going to be more important than anything else at that point for commercial value to someone who wants to buy the clip. So that's another way that if you're shooting handheld and want to move around a lot, 120 frames a second slowed down looks a lot better than some jittery handheld footage. So those are just some simple guidelines for frames per second. There is no right or wrong. Yes, if you want cinematic, the motion canvas, the nice blur, you shoot 124 at 48th of a second for 30 frames a second at 60 for the shutter speed. You know, you pick those, just double it from your frames per second to your shutter speed dial on your camera. That's all you got to do. And try to stay with that as close as you can. When you get into 120 frames a second, I've noticed by my eye, you can cheat that out a little bit if you need to set your exposure. And we'll talk about ND filters and the values of those a little bit later, but it's extremely helpful to know why you're picking your frames per second and how they work. So I hope you found this useful. Hey, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so below in the link if you find this of value to you. I also offer affiliate links for some of the gear that I use in stock, and I will be going through a lot of information on business, on photo. I'll get into photo more. I haven't done a lot of that yet, but I do quite a bit of photography as well. So, hey, thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next video.